helping you with Acorn and RISC OS computing.
So it is a different... Just then, Peter, I don't know whether they got the thing that Rob will be there himself at the sports club.
Right. Well, thanks for doing that for us. Yeah, that's good. But it is a different link. So I think we're putting that out to all our members. But otherwise, I think there's a thing on the website to remind people and ask for the link if they're non-members. We're always still looking for articles for the ROCC, and I've just put one in recently just to show you don't have to write lots. It was 100 words and a picture. So can't say that took me hours, can you, really? And for people who haven't been checking the website, the show is on at Bradford next year. It's also going to be 40 years of a club. So I think we're having some special 8-bit things trying to cover everything that's gone on in the Acorn world up to present. It's only £2 entry again, and I think we're going to have it 10:30 till 4:30. And we're looking at the possibility of having a meal maybe somewhere in Bradford because it's the 40th. So if any of the exhibitors or other people are interested, that's something to have a look forward to. And then in the 11th of Jan, which is the second Wednesday next year, 2023, frightening, it's RComp and RCI with the Pinebook Pro. So I think that's about it. And we'll now pass you on to Steve Revill of RISC OS Open. Off you go, Steve.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for the great turnout. Hopefully you're seeing my screen here.
Yeah.
Good. It's great to come and speak to you. I'm looking forward to this. So I am Steve Revill. I am from RISC OS Open. I was one of the founders of this company back in 2006, which is now quite a long time ago. And a lot has changed in that time. But one thing that hasn't really changed is why we do what we do at RISC OS Open. And that's, you can see it behind me, but you can see it on the screen as well. We really care passionately about looking after the past, the present, and the future of RISC OS and all things RISC OS. It doesn't mean we see ourselves as the ultimate arbiters or decision makers. It just means we're very passionate about helping people. If they do want to make changes, we will advise and offer our experience. So there's a few things that I wanted to cover today, and one of them is the hot topic of RISC OS 5.30. So this is the next stable release of RISC OS. I thought I'd talk you through the process of getting to a stable release and where we are in that process. So back in, let me say, May, there we go. We went through all of the different ports of RISC OS, the state of the current 5.29 beta release. And we looked at how well does it run on the Raspberry Pi, how well does it run on the Titanium, on all the various different platforms. And we also thought about which features do we really want to see finished and stable in this release of the operating system, and which ones are not quite ready enough and they won't make the cut. So we decided what the list of the features that either were finished at that point or we believed needed finishing in order to be a nice polished stable release. So that all happened back in May, and we published some tables since then of how things are going, and I'll show you a bit of that later. And the intention has been to release monthly release candidates since that point. Actually, since a few months after that point, when we'd got all the other bits and pieces together. But the brackets here is saying when possible, which essentially means when we see some significant change on any given platform, we'll re-release a release candidate of that for that platform. But what has actually happened in that time is nothing has quite crept over any significant boundaries in order to trigger the next release candidate for any platforms. But that's not to say things haven't been happening. It's just there's nothing substantial that's worthy of releasing at this point. beyond what we've already published in the current beta releases. But this will come because there are bits of progress being made. One of the things that's coming soon is a new release candidate of Pling Boot, which is kind of the heart of the disk-based part of the operating system. And when you roll over into a new multiple of 10 in the version numbers, it creates a lot of new things that you need to do under the hood inside Pling Boot. It's the things we call hook directories and various other things. So it's an opportunity we see while we're fiddling with the insides of Pling Boot to make a few other changes. And there's some useful stuff coming, which hopefully people will like. But if they don't like them, it'll be optional, and the default will be to have things the way they've always been. But there's a few bits and pieces, and I'm just teasing here. I'm not going to tell you. I'll let you all find out as we release this stuff. But that's coming imminently in the next few weeks. And the instigators of this one is us at Revill. It's one of our developers doing this. So I know where to crack the whip if it's not happening fast enough. Whereas the other release candidates for the platforms, we're at the behest of the speed that the platform maintainer can develop their code. So even though this is in progress at the moment and there are developers busily typing away at their keyboards, fixing bugs, adding new features to get the stable release, there's stuff that you can contribute to the process, even if you're not a developer, which is like most people, to be honest. One of the things that we really would like people to help us with is the user guide. It's become a tradition now that for every stable release, we publish a new updated edition of the user guide, which incorporates all of the new features that have been released in that version of RISC OS, so that you've got a companion as the user of the operating system to talk you through how to use all of the stuff that's new or that's changed. Now, there's people working on the user guide, but what we really would value is more people helping, either typing up the notes that go into the user guide or just proofreading. Even proofreading is super valuable. We just want a cross-section of people to read it, say, does that make sense to me? Did I find any errors? Some of it goes hand in hand with actually using some of our release candidates and seeing how does this stuff really work for me. But some of it you can purely just take a copy of the user guide as a work in progress, one of the drafts, and just feed back to us on how it reads. So you can get in touch with us on how to get involved with that, and I'll show you how in a bit. So next up, I want to show you the beautiful little traffic light system we've got on our website. This is essentially telling you the status of the release candidates and whether we think they are ready for prime time and ready for release as a stable version of RISC OS. And as you can see, we've got 4 platforms there that are already green. They're ready to go now. We believe they're more than stable enough. There's 2 platforms that have some outstanding issues and bugs that need squashing before we can say that they're ready. And there's a few other platforms that we don't really have an opinion yet because we haven't got all of what we need from the various platform maintainers to decide whether or not we've got a 5.30 candidate yet. In particular, the Pine book or Pine Bock, there's 2 flavors of that. There's kind of the old one, and then there's the current version. I am going to have to accept some blame here as with my rule hat on, in that the original version of the Pine Bock, we do have the source code to that, and it's tardiness on rules part that means we haven't actually plowed through that and dealt with it properly and assessed whether we've got a release candidate there or not. We don't have the source code yet to the newer version, so the jury's out there on that one. Now, a few things I would, I've already said the Pine Book. So the Pi and the Titanium, what we've got is a page on our wiki on our website where it will tell you the status of that particular port, either Pi or Titanium or even Pinebook. And it says, what do we think are the things that are blocking us from transitioning this into the next state of the traffic lights? That's partly as a steer to the platform maintainers, and partly just so that everyone in the community can see how close or far away a given platform is from being considered stable. So one of the things that I've noticed is that we haven't really done a stable release of the IMX6 or ROMAC 5, but it would be great to find ways to make that happen. And it's partly just about aligning between the platform maintainer and what rule believes we would like to see in a stable release. And it's a little bit complicated when some of the components that are used on those platforms are proprietary components and they're kind of closed source. They're not part of the general open source operating system, in which case there's a little more coordination required in order to achieve a stable release of the open source platform, to make sure that we're not, well, A, we're not looking at stuff that we shouldn't be looking at, but B, that we're not breaking that stuff either. So there are some links to the various bits and pieces on our website. There's the overarching traffic lights are on a release status page. You don't need to write this stuff down. I'm just going to send you all a copy of these slides. There is the documentation which dives deeper into the status of each platform and what we think it's what's good and what's not so good about it. And then there's a page on the user guide corrections, which tells everyone how to get engaged with that and how to help us out with the proofreading, with the writing the copy, and just making it into the best guide we can. So that's 530. Something that I haven't said yet that I should have done is we are aiming to have this out by before the Southwest show, which I believe is in February. So come hell or high water, we want to get 5.3 out within the next, 3 months or so. So that does mean that difficult decisions might be made at certain points to say some platforms are ready and some aren't, and they don't make the cut. So it will be great to get as many as we can on board, but it's happened in the past and it will happen again in the future, I'm sure, that some platforms won't quite be ready and they won't have a 5.30. But even if that happens, those platforms typically won't necessarily suffer because they can jump straight to 5.31. They just won't have been as thoroughly tested by us as they might have been. So over to the bounty scheme next. I think most people will be familiar that RISC OS Open operate a bounty scheme. We try to collect money into pots and then connect those pots of money to willing developers who are wanting to take on a challenge of adding some new thing to RISC OS or do some fettling under the hood that helps with the future of the platform. So the bounties are all things that we consider important, either from the perspective of what people are asking for on the bounties part of our forum, what the community has voted for when we've asked for votes on things, or even the things that we believe are foundational and fundamental to the operating system to allow it to add some of the things that are really important to users in the future. And if I look back at what we've done in the past with bounties, we've seen quite a lot of successful stories. So we've got all of the monitor auto detection stuff, which is brilliant. I think that's great. We have better clipboard support now in the desktop in all of the built-in apps in particular. And we have the ability to export ping images from things like Paint. We also have improved JPEG support because the JPEG standard has progressed over the last few decades and we've caught up a bit. And the USB stack was improved as well, in particular for the Raspberry Pi, for some certain versions of the Raspberry Pi. And there's some stuff that's useful for developers, which is adding support for newer versions of the ARM architecture into our compiler, which is important if you want to build code that works effectively on those newer versions of the architecture. And there's some under the hood stuff going on in the file system, which largely is foundational. So it doesn't typically yield very much in the way of end user facing improvements, but it's a stepping stone towards that. So the things that we've got going right now, yet more of that foundational stuff in the filing system. Ultimately, it would be great to support things like partitions. It would be great to support enormous video files that you get off modern devices. It would be great to support lots of files on big hard drives that RISC OS couldn't support at the moment. So all of this is what file system improvements actually means to the end user. And it's what we're aiming towards in a sequence of bounties that get us there. We've been making a lot of really good progress with Paint. There's been beta releases of this. There's lots of new fun features and even some squashing of bugs that have been there for as long as I can remember, like the using Sprite as a brush causing it to data abort. It's tempting to leave that bug in there just because it's a fundamental part of Paint, but no, we're gonna fix it. So there's a lot of good stuff coming with Paint, and it's getting very close to release, I think. We also have a whole series of bounties that, again, partly foundational, but partly adding things as we go, which is about improving the way the network stack works for things like IPv6, laying the foundations for Wi-Fi support natively in RISC OS, and various other things to do with security standards. So that's all underway at the moment. And the let's say the optimistic goal of reunifying the different flavors of toolbox that we had between the RISC OS limited version of RISC OS and the one that came out of Castle that we have inherited the maintenance of. So those two versions of the toolbox diverged. RISC OS limited added loads and loads of really useful and interesting features. Many of those didn't make their way into RISC OS 5. So there is work underway to bring those back together. And there's some stuff that's useful for developers, which is all of our source code for RISC OS lives in a thing called Git. But at the moment, accessing it natively through RISC OS is not very easy. I would argue it's close to impossible. So we're in the fairly advanced stages now of having a Git client for RISC OS. Which also has a desktop user interface, which makes it really nice to use. So if we look ahead, there are some other bounties that we are collecting for. One of them is about Unicode support, which is about supporting languages and fonts that have all these interesting non-English characters in them. There's very patchy support for this in RISC OS at the moment, but to make it a truly effective, truly international operating system, we need better support for Unicode. It's a fairly big job, but it's manageable and it's doing quite well in collecting towards it. Now we're an open source community, we're increasingly international as well. I mean, it's easier to be international and everything's web-based nowadays. We're attracting an audience from all over the place, whether it's Brazil, whether it's China, it doesn't matter. There are people accessing our website, downloading RISC OS, interacting with the rule team all over the world. So Unicode is pretty fundamental today. We also would like to see all of the programmers' reference manuals updated, which is a monster job. I'm not going to lie, it's an enormous job. But hopefully we can find someone who's really enthusiastic about looking at the fine detail of technical documentation and typing. That will be another case of needing proofreaders, almost certainly, when we start working on this. There's quite a lot to do on the USB stack still, because USB is a standard that progresses very quickly relative to many standards. And pretty much everything now is USB connected. And in Europe, very soon, everything, like every mobile phone will have to have USB-C. So USB is just becoming the de facto standard, if not, it has become that. And there's still a lot of weaknesses in the current USB stack for RISC OS. So we want to address some of the fundamental weaknesses there. Another thing that's moved on a lot is the way you interact with Windows machines. So LANManfus is the application you can run on RISC OS mount Windows shares. But for the most part, it doesn't work anymore because all of the security and protocols have moved on so much since LandManifest was written. You basically have to jump through a lot of hoops on the Windows side, telling it to switch every piece of security it has off before you can connect to your Windows PC with LandManifest nowadays, which is a shame. The logical thing to do here is to just support secure protocols. So that's what we're aiming for there. And yeah, the foundational work, the filing system improvements and the networking improvements will continue through incremental bounties. Now, then what? I guess that's the big question. Oh, hello, I just went past it. There are some big ticket items for RISC OS. Supporting multiple monitors it's actually been making progress. I think this is something Jeffrey Lee has been looking at, amongst others. We'd like to see BBC Basic modernized as well. We have a lot of ideas about how to do that. There's some great stuff with BBC Basic for Windows. There's Brandy. There's lots of other versions of Basic out there, but it would be nice to modernize BBC Basic itself. And we have ideas, but unfortunately, we don't have someone with the time to do it. I would love to do it, but I'd need to take a sabbatical of 6 months. There's stuff about large physical address extensions, which basically means you can put loads of RAM in your machine. Instead of being limited at 4 gig, you could put 32 gig in and it will work. That's actually quite hard. And it's quite a big job to do, but it's increasingly, it's the way things need to be, because if you want to edit a video file, and we've got the file system able to cope with a video file that's 30 gigabytes, actually interacting with that sort of thing in your operating system is hard if you've only got 4 gigs of RAM. And there's a thing called vector floating point, which is basically a different way of doing maths in the processor very quickly. And then we have the enormous impending doom, which is ARM 32-bit mode gradually disappearing from ARM chips. And a lot of RISC OS is written in handcrafted 32-bit ARM code. So as the world moves to 64-bit and 32 starts disappearing from the cores, there will be increasingly ARM chips that are just not capable of running RISC OS at all. And it needs a fairly substantial rewrite to deal with that. So these are some pretty meaty challenges here. And really, they've been meaty challenges for a while, and nothing's really, well, apart from a lot of good stuff that's been happening in the community and enthusiasts like Jeffrey plugging away at things. In terms of us having a bounty, for example, or really tackling these things head on, there's very little to show for all the time that we've been aware of these things. And it causes us to ask the question of, are we taking the right approach? Do bounties work? And I think we can see from what I've shown you, there's plenty of evidence that bounties do deliver, but it might be the mode of how they operate and the mode of how they deliver that means that they're fundamentally not suited to this type of activity, to delivering these types of changes to the operating system. We've been thinking about this at RULE, and we've been thinking about the why behind it and what to do about it. And if you'll allow me, I'll talk you through what we've been thinking. And some of you will be familiar with this. This is the faster, cheaper, better triangle. It's a bit divisive, and you have to be careful if you're applying this to how you think about these things. But it does hold some water. For example, in the way we operate our bounties at RULE, I make no bones with admitting cheaper is the top priority. So really, we're setting a bounty target for something which is either minimum wage, given the amount of hours we think it's going to take someone to do it, or much worse than minimum wage, maybe an order of magnitude less than minimum wage. And that begs the question of who beyond the most enthusiastic of enthusiasts is going to actually take something on. The next priority for us, and it's quite far down relative to cheaper, unfortunately, because of how cheap we're going, but it is better. So better to us is super important. If you look at this, we don't want things to be cobbled together. We don't want to rush it. We don't want to sacrifice the future for the sake of doing the thing now and paint ourselves into a corner. So it's very important to us, just shift my camera a bit, to balance. Yes, we have to be able to achieve a total in the totalizer that's realistic, which usually means a couple of grand. And what we deliver from that needs to be good and future-proof and backwards compatible, and people, delivering the core function that people care about. The thing, unfortunately, that sits at the very bottom of the priority is faster. And many people will probably have seen that. Our bounties do not deliver quickly. And in the case of quite a few of them, if we took an honest assessment of the ones that we've currently got in progress, and some of them we've projected the end date in 2030 something. And that's not great. At the current rate of progress, it might finish in 2034. So it works very well, I think, for the smaller tasks. The things that aren't complicated and where the considerations of forward and backward compatibility are less pressing, and it's more about features or the appearance of something. So I think the bounty scheme works quite well for that, and it's not so good for bigger and more complicated things. Now I'm going to switch to something that could be considered contentious, but only if you don't interpret what I'm saying carefully. We have a very different model to RISC OS developments, and RISC OS developments have made some very intelligent and deliberate choices, and they're funded differently and structured differently. And they knock us out of the park on the faster. So that priority, and it's arguably it's very important to the end user to get from the concept to something they can actually use in a reasonable amount of time. That is better in some ways, but it's about speed. And the other thing that they do very differently to us is the cheaper. They've lowered the priority of cheaper, so they're investing more heavily. So they're collecting more money up front, and they're paying people a much better rate, much closer to commercial rates. But it's not full-on commercial rates from the perspective of the outside world. It's not far off, though. It's a million times closer than RUL can get. So they've prioritized investing in getting the development and getting it to people quicker. Now, I'm saying better is suffering here, but I'm not saying that relative to RUL. That's not the intention of these two comparisons. Better is just saying, if you do something and you achieve it in a year and you pay someone more to do it, if you took the RUL length of time at that rate of pay and took a decade on it, paying someone that much, then the output would be vastly different to the thing that you've done in a year at that rate. So I'm just saying, based on that's how this faster, cheaper, better triangle works. You can't have all 3 points at the very top of your priorities at the same time. So don't compare one to the other and say the better is higher or lower. It's just a relative thing relative to the other priorities. But it's an interesting model because they can tackle bigger ticket items and deliver something that is still useful to the end user in a sensible amount of time, which is interesting. There are things that they are doing and decisions they're having to make, the hard-nosed commercial decisions that sometimes from RUL's perspective, we think, well, architecturally, maybe we set a higher bar for forwards or backwards compatibility. But sometimes there's a risk that you're letting the better be the enemy of the good. And maybe you just have to say, so I think Rod's take a pragmatic view, so there's no criticism here, and they've arrived at what I think is something a bit like this. But then my argument would be, even this is not sufficient for those really big ticket items, unfortunately, because what I think those need is something like this. And this is about money, no object now. So you've deprioritized the cost of doing it. And you've said, yes, we need to get it to people in a reasonable amount of time, but equally, we need to do everything right because everything depends on it. The whole future depends on it. If you get the ARM64 bit wrong, you're still dead in the water. So this model, it's not a solution, but it's what I would propose would need to happen if you want to see those big ticket items meaningfully progressed in a sensible amount of time. And I can't answer how we would achieve this. All I can say is, if you want to do one of those sorts of tasks, like the 64-bit, for example, you're no longer in the realm of we can pay a developer an okay rate for a year. You're in a world of we need to build a team of developers and have a project manager, and they need to be paid. You know, this project's going to cost 7 figures now. This is a big project. So there's the question, I think the only way to answer this question and achieve these things, this is my belief, is somehow we need to find a way to attract 7-figure sum type investments into RISC OS to allow these kind of the big ticket, big hitter items to happen. Otherwise, we can chip away at them, but they may never happen fast enough, or they may never be quite good enough. But I think the other conclusion I would draw is our bounty scheme will not solve them, unfortunately. So we somehow within the community we'll have to find a way to do it, a different way to do it. So food for thought, and unfortunately no great answers, but at least it shows this is some of the thinking that goes on behind the scenes. And with that, I will open the floor to questions.
One of the things you mentioned was things you're doing to paint. Can you tell me some of the things? I've not had a look at the nightly builds or anything, so I've not seen this in the last few months.
Yep.
What sort of things is paint getting up to now?
I can do better than that. I will show you what the bounty page says. So let me open a window what I opened earlier. Improvements to paint, here we go. Just share screen. There we go. So you can see there's quite a lot of things here.
It's still catching up, actually, on mine.
Yeah, I've got a black window.
Yeah. Yeah, we just got, well, I've got people on the side view, but we haven't got your screen being shared currently. So if you want to go back one and try again.
It looks like Steve has frozen.
That's it then. Yeah.
Steve left us. Oh dear.
Oh, lots of shuffling.
He's back.
Hello. So you know
Yes.
I was talking about bugs in paint. Well, it's cursed Zoom. So
If you can talk us through, that'd be fine. If
Yeah.
it's sort of like 5 or 6 major points.
I'll just tell you very briefly. Fingers crossed, no crashes. Can you see this now?
Hey.
Oh yes, got there.
So-
Yeah.
We've got a whole load of new formats for sprites, and a lot of it is about having alpha channels, so varying
Right,
levels of
yeah.
transparency.
Yeah.
And it's all of the different DPIs which you can actually edit rather than just having it when you've loaded it in a certain DPI, it's stuck there. There's a load of stuff in the user interface that just makes it much nicer to use. There's some irritating features that Paint has always had that we've kind of clobbered. You can reorder sprites in the window, all of that sort of thing. And yeah, there's a whole load of stuff to do with color handling as well. There's one here from a forum post that was inspired by a forum post, which is about changing the color palette so it's more logical to an artist rather than in some weird arbitrary palette order. So it's just quality of life improvements, bug fixes, and significant functional improvements.
Yeah. The thing I did see there was one of the things I was looking for, and that's different fonts for text and sizes. One thing I'm sure I asked about, I don't think I logged it officially. What do we call it? Just going back a step in case you get it horribly wrong. So trying to remember what the official name for that is. Yeah.
Oh, undo.
Undo, yes, undo. One would be nice, more would be better, but even if it's just a temp area that's made up somewhere that you don't show to us, and then we go, right, let's go back.
So yes, indeed, undo and redo are on the list for this version of Paint.
Yippee!
And
lots of happy punters there.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of having lots of RAM or even lots of hard drive space and fast hard drives nowadays. Is undo and redo are a lot less problematic than they used to be in the olden days.
Yeah, that's good. And of course, the semi-transparency, you can use it for sort of like subtitles and things like that, can't you? So rather than obscuring something completely, you can still see both and choose how much you're seeing.
So the operating system already supports that. So you can have alpha transparent sprites with partial transparency. Even the WIMP supports that now. So I created a tile sprite, which is the background image on the icon bar that had a graduated fill.
Right.
So it gradually faded into the backdrop image.
Yeah.
And I used alpha transparency to do that. But it's not well handled in Paint yet, which is part of the reason why we've got this on the bounty.
Okay. Yeah, because I know I used to do video titling, and that, of course, was one of the things you wanted was alpha transparency for deciding how much your titles were in front or whatever of your background.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's all good. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
I'll
Any
pass
other
on to somebody
questions?
else now. Yeah.
When do you think Git's going to arrive? Because you were talking about it in the summer.
Yeah, it's inching along. Let me see if I can.
Because it says 28%.
I wouldn't say inching
on
along.
the-
It's actually going along quite well. Let me see if we've had any recent drops of it. I'm very cagey about giving estimated time of arrival for bounties. Before 2034. I'm hoping it's not too far off, to be honest. I think a lot of the core Git commands are now working. The user interface is largely working as well. I've forgotten what the outstanding issues are. I think maybe we should I'll make a note that we should just publish an update somewhere on the forum and let people know how it's going.
Yeah, presumably that's something that will just help people who are new to programming in RISC OS, that it's sort of like a standard repository, isn't it?
It's notoriously not very friendly. So if you're new to programming, it's not helpful. But if you're new to RISC OS, it'll be very helpful because you'll already probably have used Git elsewhere if you're a developer.
So in a way, that getting that going would help people to possibly get to doing bits of bounties potentially.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that it really helps with is streamlining the development cycle, in that you can manage all of the source code for what you're working on in Git. You can modify something, you can check it out, you can merge it with something else. and then you can just try it there and there because you're doing it all on RISC OS. You can try the results of your labour, and you don't have any painful cycles of transferring things between this machine and that machine. Just try it. So having it all natively there in RISC OS is the best for developing RISC OS software.
Yeah, so hopefully all these people from different countries will put a little bit in somewhere. That'd be good.
Yeah.
There's a few questions come through in the chat.
Oh.
Notably, Christian helpfully points out that 2034 is in 10 minutes' time.
Ah, there we go. Right, better get those bounties all finished.
Do you want the other ones? Or is it Steve Fryatt? Are you here? Do you want to put the questions yourself?
I can do. They're not actually mine. They were from Andy Marks, who couldn't make it along this evening. But the first one, I don't think any of them have been answered yet explicitly. So the first one was: are we all currently working on a Wi-Fi stack on top of the current RUL network stack developments?
No, we're not. So that is a future bounty. So we're laying the foundations for that at the moment. But we do have amongst our numbers, we have people who have worked on Wi-Fi stacks in the past. So we have experience of that. But RISC OS underlying stack isn't ready for it yet.
Okay. The next question was another one about bounties. He's asking, has anyone expressed any kind of interest in the USB bounty? And if not, what's the plan to drum up or seek out interest given the current bounty amount? So I'm assuming
yes. So a couple of people have expressed interest in that. The preferred person, unfortunately, for health reasons, had to temporarily suspend their interest in it. But we know they would do a really great job of it. So we're prepared to sit and give them a bit of time to see how things pan out. But should that not go the way we want, there are other people who are potentially interested in that one.
Okay, thanks. And the final question from Andy was, is there any work being done on accessing the PCIe port on the Compute 4 module?
I have no idea.
Right. Okay, thanks.
There's honesty for you. A little bit.
Yeah. Is someone able to capture these questions and circulate them in email afterwards, and then we can at least do some digging?
That'll be Chris Hughes or Rick Sterry.
Thank you.
I can't do it because I haven't got. I'm not an administrator on this account. Chris, are you still with us? Chris, can you save the chat before you turn?
Yeah, I'll save the chat.
Thank you.
Somebody said to me on the last meeting I did that you can just copy and paste the text straight out into a text document. So you don't actually need to be admin to save the text chat out.
That would be great. Thank you.
One message at a time, according to this one. But I'm on Linux at the moment, but I don't know if it's different on another platform.
Do we have any other questions in the chat?
Actually, it's
yes.
Chat on the little 3-dot pop-up menu.
Yeah.
Bottom right allows you to save a text. Anybody can save a text copy.
Oh, right. We live and learn. Thank you, Andrew.
I didn't know until too late.
Thanks, Andrew.
Share the info. While I'm talking, Steve, about a year ago, we paid one of the directors of RUL to do some work on SDIO, and sort of about 2/3 of that has fed out into the thing, but it's still
Yeah.
some, particularly the Pi stuff, hasn't yet made it into the nightlies.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, it's actually holding back development at this point, and a year's quite a long time.
I know who you mean, and it's not me, so I will chase them.
It would be really, really helpful if you could.
Yeah.
Certainly with an eye to 5.30, because decent SDIO is fairly important too. But
yeah, agreed. I will do some whip cracking.
Question from Bernard saying, are the RISC OS developments and RUL work on the internet and TCP/IP complementary or overlapping? That should be interesting.
I'd say probably overlapping more than complementary. there's similar goals in mind. So it's interesting that there are two different approaches. You could see that as, negative, but also I see that as the positive of an open source operating system is people can approach a problem in a different way, in their own way, and you can let the community decide what they want to do going forwards, which one they prefer, what works for them. That's my take.
Some would say the community doesn't get much choice when it's baked into the ROM.
No, that's the reason I raised the question in a way, because it's so fundamental to the use of the operating system that the internet stack works in a particular way, I would have thought. And therefore you don't want a competition in that area. You want complementary work to help each other. Yeah, that would be great. There's a backstory that as to how these divergent paths were taken, and unfortunately we can't dictate what people do, and we can't choose what they work on and what they don't work on. We can't choose whether they engage with our bounties or not. That's other people's choice. And as to whether it's baked into a ROM or not, well, it's an open source operating system. Anyone can host their own ROMs. Anyone can build their own ROMs. Indeed, many of the platform maintainers build their own non-rule ROMs with their own non-open source software even in them. And that's their choice. So really, it's the nature of open source is you end up with forking. One way or another, forks will develop. And ultimately, the users are the deciders of if they're buying this platform and that's the operating system that comes with it, then that's the operating system they use. If they really prefer the features they find on a different platform, then they'll ask that platform maintainer to add them or incorporate them somehow. I think that's just, it is the way open source operating systems work, and it's the nature of the beast. But I'm much happier knowing that we've got people developing stuff than not developing stuff. Yeah, I agree with that. Well, okay, that's a good answer. It is a sort of philosophical question in a way, but with a small market, I'm not sure that one wants too much bifurcation. Yeah, it's difficult. Lowering the barriers to entry to getting developers is the best thing we can do to allow more and more work to happen, because I've talked about the self-fulfilling prophecy of more good development creates more features, which attracts more users, which puts more money in the platform, which attracts more developers. If we can get lots of people working on RISC OS, then it will enrich the operating system and draw more users in. Thank you.
Steve, on this matter, actually, I have tried for a couple of years now to run Hacktoberfest on GitHub, which did indeed call attention of a wider range of developers, non-RISC OS habituals. Mm-hmm. So it does work, but there obviously have been a set of issues. One of them was, and that's why I reconnect to what you just said, the cost of the development environment required for doing things for RISC OS. And at least for whatever I do on GitHub, I always try to maintain compatibility with DDE and GCC, both of them. And therefore, people have to test on DDE. That was one of the problems. The other problem, obviously, is having documentation videos on YouTube. You are not guilty of this because this is stuff that, as you know well, is developed by the community itself for other operating systems, for Linux, for BSD and stuff. So please don't get any of this like I'm pointing fingers at Roll. It's just the way it is, right? So we should do it, actually. And I'm trying the little time I have. I published the documentation how to install DDE correctly, also on all the RISC OS versions. how to use DDT and all these things, and I'm adding more. Just fortunately, time is what it is. But there are these type of barriers. Documentation, typical sources of information like videos, the cost of the development environment, and also some issues related to GCC, because obviously GCC SDK creates binaries that are a bit heavy, and there are a lot of, let's call them tricks and tips that are not available, and only people that have been coding since I was a kid like me knows them, because we learned it from the time of Acorn and everything else. So do you guys have any idea to suggest as well to the community, to us, not necessarily the role has to do, to solve some of these issues? And do you have any plan for the development environment?
Yeah, so there's various things on the development environment. One is that we're perfectly willing to sponsor people who claim bounties to just give them a copy of the DDE. The other thing we do is we've offered it free for students. There are various other schemes that we run from time to time to try and make the development tools more available. But there's a couple of factors that are worthy of note. Is quite often we don't get much uptake for this in the first place, which suggests that there aren't that many people looking, or that what really is needed is the marketing splash that goes outside of the existing community to reach those people. And the second thing is the DDE is one of the better sources of money coming into Rule. Our very limited bit of money coming in. The DDE is one of the things that shows that we can rely on, will help make the show pay for itself. So if we did make it free, which I don't think we can legally, but I mean, even in that case, you reduce it to £1 or something. But if we did slash the price of it, we would have to find another way to fund the things that Rule does. So quite often, I think a lot of people are hesitant, and not so much in the RISC OS community. We find it's quite generous. It's very generous. But people are hesitant to purely donate to support a thing, or at least to keep donating, to remember that a thing started in 2006 and 18 years later, or however many years later, it's still trying to run. It still needs money to run. So it's great to donate, but people often find it easier to buy something than donate. And the DDE is one of those things that we sell, and then we update it every so often and sell an upgrade, a half price upgrade. So it does mean it's like a donation, but it's more reliable than donations typically are.
Thank you. And then the last bit is this, because we had this discussion over email, because people, even you asked me, why GitHub? Why not doing things directly on the GitLab? But that's because GitHub has become an hub for many developers, where there is a lot into it for them. The more commits, the more pull requests they do, the more points they gain. They create literally a CV of what they've been working on there, that then they share on LinkedIn and all this stuff. And this is particularly important for young developers. I'm at the end of my career now. It's been almost 40 years of coding. I don't care much, but the youngest, they do. And if you want to have new people at least getting curious about it, what about Role at least hosting an official mirror on GitHub or things like this? Not necessarily the main thing, just copy from GitHub, from GitLab to GitHub, because for example, BSD does that. And things like
we could treat our GitLab as an upstream master, and
exactly. So people can still do things on RISC OS in the environment they like, in the environment where they gain point, where basically RISC OS offers something to them. Because as you said, food for thought, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that a lot of people misunderstand of open source. Open source is not charity. Open source is not being good people or things like this. Open source is about what's in it for me. Literally is, if you want, is the maximum form of egoism. Some people may define it this way, where each developer gives back just because they had to fix something that they needed. And it's the license that kind of forced them in some aspect to give back. And this is what true open source actually truly is. This is why you got now all these companies around Linux, Intel, Microsoft as well. You've got Red Hat, you got IBM, you got all these people that are pushing a lot of money into it, are pushing a lot of development hours into it. It's because it's their need. They are not being good people. They need to deliver, and it's the quickest and cheapest way for them to deliver through Linux. So if you want to address risk cost somewhere in that direction, it really needs to open a lot and making sure that we put an emphasis on what's in it for others. And kickstart this process, right? I'm sorry for taking all this time.
I'm talking while muted, so that's not.
We thought you'd gone.
Zoom 101 there. Yeah, I like those suggestions. I like the idea. I mean, you're right. There's an underlying thing here that software developers are changing. They're a different breed. There's a cultural, psychological difference between the younger engineer now than the people at the other end of our careers. And yeah, it would be interesting to get some new blood to help with the thinking at RULE, for example, because it may be that what we think is a good route for doing something is not necessarily going to resonate with the people that we really need to be attracting. Yeah, good thought.
You were saying about the DDL, I can't remember. Basically documentation, something you got money for. How's about having a January sale and possibly linking it into 40 years of the BBC? I don't know if that's something that could go in some of the tech magazines or whether we've passed their date for January or February issues.
Yeah.
Just a thought, 10% off, whatever. Have a look at this, see what you think.
I think the realization that is kind of collectively coming to me is that it's not about having a sale, it's about publicizing it effectively so that the new blood that you're trying to reach becomes aware of it rather than preaching to the people who already have it. So yeah, it's a good idea. If we're going to do another sale on the DDE, let's make it so that it's reaching a new audience.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, as you say, a lot of us are of a certain age, aren't we?
I'm not.
If you were talking about new blood and getting new programmers in, and that's obviously brilliant, definitely want to champion that. But what's the procedure for new developer or any developer to, if they want to submit code that falls outside of the currently open bounties?
Yeah, you just either, if we were mirroring this stuff onto GitHub, you would raise merge requests through the normal GitHub mechanisms, and if you were doing it through GitLab, it's the same thing. So you just engage directly with GitLab through that mechanism. So you can make any changes you want, you can add any new features, and you can just raise a merge request.
But I think Andrew was asking more like what the process is since one raised it, because, any idea of the average time before acceptance?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I see where you're going. So the thing about that GitLab is that we host it, but that doesn't mean we're the free consultancy that does all the reviewing of everything and the bug fixing of everything and the testing of everything. it's supposed to be a community server for community of developers. And if the only people commenting on any merge request or any change, and the only people bothering to test it are the people at Rule, the answer to the question is it will all go extremely slowly because we have very little time to do all of that. So really for GitLab, for any RISC OS development to be successful and to move swiftly, especially an open source operating system, you need a community of people actively engaged with all of the work that's happening in it. So they're not sat in a silo just working on their little bits. They're looking at the other things going on and adding their 2p into that. They're adding their thoughts and they're testing it for other people. So we're very much reliant on a community of developers helping, because it may look like position of being the arbiters of what is and isn't accepted, but we don't want it to be that way because we know we don't have the time to do that. All we want to do is offer our help and support where if we can, we will look at stuff or we will answer questions, but we really need everyone else to chip in as well.
On which note, who are the people who are allowed to accept code and accept and review code and allow merge requests?
Anyone who volunteers for that.
And are there currently any people who are not Rule directors in that? And Jeffrey Lee, of course, in that.
The Rule is not entirely made up of Rule directors, but yes, there are people outside of the Rule team as well.
But there should be a list of maintainers because obviously, ultimately, you want a review from an authority, right? Somebody that you trust. It's a chain of trust. Otherwise, I could just push malware in it and says,
yeah.
So I think that's what Andrew's asking, right? Who are the officials, people that at least collect the patches? Oh, I don't know. I mean, this is, sorry to sound a bit confused, but this is very different than how the open source model works, where you actually have official maintainers that do the review because obviously they have to accept the patch.
Yeah, we'd be happy to put up a wiki page and describe how we think the process should work and who is in what role in the process, and ask for volunteers for people into those roles. I have absolutely no objection to doing that. Okay. One of the things, the patterns that we generally see is someone submits something into the Rule GitLab and they just throw it over the fence at us and then they just like wash their hands of it. And it's like, there you go, I've given you all our stuff that doesn't merge with anything and has loads of bugs and has things that we've commented on, and we say, well, you shouldn't have done that way. Can you refactor it? And then there's just radio silence from then on. So that's a common pattern for people contributing into the Rule GitLab. And that soaks up a vast amount of time doing that. And every time you go around a loop of chasing someone and asking for clarification or asking how they're getting on with changing something, that's work. And it's work that's very precious. It's time. So really, we need a community of people that are involved in all of the review stage. We need developers to treat it as not a big bucket that they can just chuck their code into. It's a thing where you have to collaboratively arrive at a consensus that a merge request is going to be accepted.
Sure, I'm going to make you laugh, but did you check if they had the Rule email for the notification from GitLab? Not in their spam list, just... We had problems with that. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I appreciate this is a very kind of technical conversation, but it's an important part of how the community works together. And so I think it's a great suggestion there that we just need a really clear wiki page that describes how does the contributing to RISC OS process work, who's doing what role in that process, and where do we have gaps where there's simply not enough people in a particular role, which is probably partly part of the problem.
I am happy to learn to help you on this because this is not a code contribution that may give me issues, contractual issue, but This is just a review, so I'm happy if you guys have any guide to learn, because obviously I have to become trusted, right? Somehow, not hacking around or pushing code just because I like it, or because I have a bad day, I refuse it, or things like this, right? But if there is anything on that regard, I'm happy to provide my help on that one. This one should be totally fine in contractual things.
Thank you.
I mean, it certainly sounds as though this is something that needs to be more clearly explained, because I was certainly under the impression, as somebody who hasn't contributed but has watched the contribution process, that the process you've described as being not what you want was how it was supposed to work. So it sounds like there's been a massive break in communication somewhere with the community.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's been a source of frustration for the people actively doing all this reviewing and thinking, why is no one else engaging with this? And the answer is because we've not been very clear about what the process is supposed to be.
And Steve, I was going to sort of say that doesn't that sort of lend itself? I know you're talking about a wiki page, but it's almost like, if you go to and spend like an hour or something, perhaps you could have almost like a developer conference or developer Zoom meeting or something like that. If you're going to start allocating maintainers and everything else or publicising it, to get everyone singing off the same page, would it not be, helpful to do that, record it, and then place it somewhere as well, along with the wiki?
Code review is a very complex job. It's not simple. So on this, I am totally with Roll. I know that it's been slow and all this stuff, but I don't want to point finger, because it is a very complicated job. And as a senior engineer, you have to do it for the company you work for, right? It's part of the task. And there are a lot of elements. It's not just the correctness of the code, which, by the way, has to be proved. And the fact that on RISC OS there is a lack of test automation that we cannot even put into the pull request process means that the code reviewer will actually have to figure it out, what you've done, how you've done it. Have you followed the standards? It's assembly, it's not intuitive, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of complexity. And on RISC OS, it is even more complex. We need to make this concept clear. Steve didn't say it, but I want to say it for them. It is not an easy job. It is not a job that everyone can do, like, for example, proofreading a user guide, okay? So it requires people that have skills on ARM assembly, on RISC OS, and obviously are well aware of the entire process as well, because they need to justify their choices. Possibly in the future, this is, Steve, forgive me and allow me also to pull your ears on this. Guys, you need to implement test automation. We really need to figure out a way to do this on RISC OS. I ported a couple of libraries, one that works on DDE, one that works on GCC. If the request is to make sure that assembly can call those libraries for test automation, I'm happy to work on that. But we need to find a way to introduce test automation, because it is fundamental for this. And I know it's very complicated. I'm not making it simple. I'm not making the usual post on Roll, let's go 64-bit because it's the future. It is very complex. I'm with you guys. I understand the pain, but we have to do something on that direction. It's very important for everyone. And
this is something that we would very much welcome talking to you about. One of the things we've been looking at is using the pipelines in GitLab, which is essentially, if someone submits some code, you can have it automatically go and then take that code, merge it in with the operating system, build things, run it on an emulator, check it doesn't blow up, and then immediately you'll get a traffic light on your thing that says, well, we tested it and it blew up on a Raspberry Pi or something like that. That's the sort of thing that's being spoken about here. And this is the sort of thing that we would like to have in our RISC OS GitLab. But again, it's a question of time and energy, and having people with a bit of time and the right skill set would be really helpful.
Sure. For whatever I can do, remember always that limitation, but I'm very happy to help. And there is already stuff that I ported, so you can actually start playing with them. They work with DDE, they work with GCC. If one day there's going to be GCC in the process, they work on RISC OS, but they are standard. So in case you're running some kind of fancy, because I remember Norcroft can also run on Linux and on Windows. Some of the old version, I don't know if it is still possible. They also work on Linux and eventually on Windows. So there is a lot that can be done. Part of it is already on my GitHub, the RISC OS community thing that I call it community, just to send a message to everybody that has to be, we all have to do something about it. It's not just rely on Roll or Rod, because obviously you guys are two companies. You described it very well. You have a problem with including people that is an economical issue. And there is nothing that can be done on that, because if there is not a market, there is no interest, right? They will come to you and says, oh, you know what? I can do all this, but you have to give me 10 grand because RISC OS is nothing, and I will get nothing but the money out of this. It is possible, right? Another thing that you could, maybe you already had a look at this, but there are companies in specific countries that do the job, and now they all code on ARM for much less money. So like outsourcing the job. Yeah. But again, these are not people expert in RISC OS. So until we have a full learning path how to code on RISC OS from zero to hero, how are we going to do this? It's not possible, right? Which is why I started to tackle that problem as the first one, and literally create all possible resources for people that have absolutely no idea how to get from zero to being able to literally code on RISC OS and in the various languages. But by the way, advertisement for the code meeting. If you guys want to give a speech, share knowledge, please feel free. Sorry, close advertisement.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just thinking, conscious of time, are there any non-technical questions remaining?
Steve, a question on the chat here. Somebody put on, I'd like to go back to the internet stack business. Steve suggests that users can choose, but what will the rule stack offer that the user might prefer to what the ROD version offers? Will an ordinary user actually see any difference?
I don't know, because I don't know what the end state of both will be to compare them.
Why are you developing a stack, if you like, when we've already got a stack developed?
Different philosophical approaches. So different approaches to, for example, backwards compatibility or forwards compatibility, different approaches to architecturally how it's implemented, how much it affects the applications that exist, how much developers have to learn something new versus having something that already exists. There's a number of different design decisions that you can make and decisions you can make. And quite a bit of that will be under the hood. But side by side, I don't know how the two will compare. If they are finished, what will be the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two? I don't know.
Steve, I've heard you say that before. I just want to clarify a point, because you said it before and I've not understood. You talk about backwards compatibility and what application developers will have to do, and what about legacy applications and so on.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the rules, I mean, I know that we have 100% compatibility as far as I'm aware with existing applications and historical things. Are you saying that that's not going to be the case for a rule stack, or were you suggesting that perhaps?
I'm saying one way uses BSD sockets, the other one doesn't. One goes through glue layers, the other one doesn't. I'm saying there are architectural differences.
Again, I'm sorry, one doesn't support BSD sockets. Are you, again, is that the rules one? Because I know we do.
So I'm saying that the approach is through the way the internet stack talks is talked to through an application. We're into technical again. I was hoping for a non-technical question. We philosophically don't want to have to operate through glue layers. We want to use the native DCI4 style interface that is there in the internet stack and has been there since the 90s.
Yeah, so do we, because that's what we're using.
Yeah.
Sorry,
through compatibility layers.
You parrot things that suggest that our stack is not adequate when it is working.
I'm not saying it's inadequate. I'm saying there are differences. There are implementation differences, and the two pieces of work coexisted simultaneously, and they have gone in slightly different directions. And that is, it is what it is.
Is it not a luxury, though, to be devoting any effort at all to duplication?
No, because it's a choice. And the people who are doing this work care passionately about the decisions they've made and the direction of travel. And they have a belief about where that's going to take the stack and the operating system. And if they're the ones doing the work, it is their choice. That's the beauty of an open source operating system, is if a developer chooses to do some work, that is their choice. And I'm not going to deny them that choice.
And the submission process for the rule stack what's the oversight procedure for that? Will that take a year for it to go through?
But that all goes through GitLab, the same as any other merge requests.
So the merge requests, are they? Oh no, I'll take this offline. No point. Yeah, that's fine.
I'll ask you.
If you want to host a version of RISC OS and fast track code through that, you are welcome to host a version of RISC OS and fast track code through that. If you use the rule GitLab, then we're part of that process, but we don't want to be a barrier to that process. We want it to be a community resource. But I think through what we've been talking about today, we could do a better job of advertising that we want the community to be engaged under the hood of it, as well as just contributing into it.
As a third-party developer, I'm really unclear from all this how having two companies fighting over the internet stack is going to help me make my software compatible with the official rule distribution that comes from the rule website and this mythical, hypothetical third-party alternative distribution that's potentially being sold on other hardware. And I think it would be really useful if that could be clarified this evening, because it doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't see why I should have to suddenly make my software compatible with two different branches of the operating system just to satisfy what appears to be two egos.
Because it's got nothing to do with egos, it's to do with developers writing code. And developers are writing code, they want to write some code. We're not going to say no to people.
Sure, and hold on, guys, because I think the conversation is shifting towards personal beliefs. Steve. Okay, so here's the thing. I've been a developer for a long time. Worked with big companies, small companies, startups, people that I have patents and all these things. One thing that role should do to achieve what you say is to be clear. Because otherwise people will take decisions. I mean, and then you end up having something that you don't want for whatever reason. There could also be a good reason. But when things are unclear, it's impossible to have and I know this may sound like, hey, but that means I have to work more, I have to write more documentation, I have to, and I'm sorry for that, but there is no escape. And otherwise things will get more and more like this. Imagine having more people trying to do things for RISC OS. They will overload role in many senses. This is a typical example of what can happen when you start to have more people working on RISC OS. It is important. you probably noticed that the way I'm tackling things is make it clear first and then let's code, and not vice versa.
So I agree, and we did several years before any work on TCP/IP stacks was started. Rule made it abundantly clear what was needed, what we were asking the community to get together and support, what we were asking them to input into and help define and refine. And for whatever reason, a choice was made not to engage with Rule, to go under a different route without communicating it to Rule, without sharing any information. And then Rule started what Rule is doing. And then the two worlds have collided. And at that point, it is unfortunate, but you've got people who are very committed to one route, and then you've got people who are very committed to another route. We're happy to see both exist, but we're not going to police other people's code or other people's platforms or other people's forks.
I think the concern people have got here, though, is that as is being discussed in the chat quite extensively at the moment, one side has been funded by investors into ROD. The other side is being funded by rule bounties. So it looks like effectively people's money is now being spent twice to do two parallel and effectively competing sets of development. And that whatever we're saying about people's coding choices, if you're spending the community's money, spending it twice on two incompatible sets of work or two competing sets of work just seems madness, especially given what you were saying about the faster, cheaper, better question. That's a bounty's worth of money that could be going on doing something less cheap.
It's going on exactly what the bounty is saying it's going on, though. It's not like people have put money into a bounty that they didn't know what they were putting it into. So we're spending people's money on what they wanted us to spend it on.
But would they have put that money in if they knew that somebody else was going to do it?
Well, this is one of the challenges of the bounty scheme. If someone else comes along and decides to usurp a bounty or come alongside it and then release something halfway through, that you end up in this situation. And time and energy has been spent, money has been spent, frankly, on getting somewhere. It's important, if we have a bounty scheme, that people who have funding to do some developments don't target developments that are the same as what we have in our bounty scheme. Or if they are thinking of doing that, come and coordinate with us first. And then we can remove that bounty and say that we found a better way. What you're seeing is a failure of community collaboration.
Don't wind me up any further, Steve.
Can we take the politics offline, please, again?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we take a lesson that please don't let this happen again?
That would be fantastic. And we're more than happy. All of the ideas for bounties are published on wiki pages. They're voted on by the community. The upcoming bounties are published on the bounty page. The active bounties are published on the bounty page. We make no secret of any of it. If anyone has suggestions or ideas or wants to do something differently, we're happy to have the conversations about it.
Can I raise a different one, completely different one? One of the things you said was going to be seriously expensive was coping with 64-bit.
Yes.
Is there a workaround for that just by emulation?
Yes, crudely. Just by emulation is probably the easiest but least desirable long-term solution, because usually that ends up being quite hard to reap the benefits of the better architecture that you're running on, because it's essentially hidden from the operating system. But it could well be the easiest and simplest stepping stone to get past the barrier of not supporting 64-bit at all.
Another one, Steve. Landman FS.
Yes.
That's on the bounty page. So have you had any sort of people chomping at the bit for that one?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, I know in the meantime, I think Chris Grantham is doing a little port of ShareView that seems seems to be going along nicely. And I guess that's the same sort of thing that's happening with IPP printing, stroke PWG raster printing. So,
yeah,
you know, I guess some of the things, there's going to be stuff that's done outside of bounties, and there's going to be some that hopefully then gets assumed back, but it depends on obviously where that core element has come from.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Okay. Okay. So nobody chomping at the bit for Landman FS yet.
There might be, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. I've not been pursuing that particular bounty.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions?
I did ask earlier in the chat, actually. You said that the PRM reformatting, rewriting, updating needed work, and we all know that that's true. But wasn't work started on this? Has that stalled?
So it wasn't really started by rule. I know there's some people who are in the community who are doing something with PRMs, and we've reached out to them and spoken to them. So that may be another route. So there's an idea to make it into a format that's more accessible, so it's easier to edit and easier to maintain going forwards. But that hasn't really come to any conclusion.
But what I'm saying is if it's known work in progress, it's something you at least have an eye on, even if it's not part of a bounty. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you for your time. It's been a really good turnout, and I've enjoyed the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. And we'll catch up with you, I'm sure, at one of the shows as well.
Yeah, hopefully see you at the Southwest show.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Steve.